in Havana, Cuba, at the U.S. Embassy were complaining about hearing the strange signal being transmitted to them, followed by short-term, long-term memory loss, brain fog, vertigo, nausea, and strange ailments to their extremities, almost like a electrical vibration going through them. And Colonel Greg Egren testified at that hearing that indeed this phenomenon is real. It is happening here in the United States on our homeland and abroad. And he said it is happening to the very best of our best.
Hi, Soul Family, and welcome to my channel. I'm your host, Haji, and this is the first of its kind amazing stories, mysteries, and intrigues. And our guest today is Jesse Beltran. Am I saying that right? Jesse?
That is correct.
All
Correct.
right. Jesse Beltran, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Thank you for allowing me to be on your platform. The things that I will cover today are very important as far as public awareness and public education. And so that is the mission that I've set out to accomplish here. Just to let everyone know, my name is Jesse Beltran. I'm a retired Sacramento City firefighter paramedic out of the state of California. I retired out of there, and shortly thereafter, during that tenure, I was the co-owner of the third largest ISP, which is Internet Service Provider in the state of California. And we were the first to implement direct line of sight microwave high-speed data because cable and fiber wasn't available back then. After I retired, I became the president of an organization called the International Center Against the Abuse of Covert Technologies. And the reason that organization was founded was because there was a phenomenon that was happening here in the United States that I felt needed to be addressed. And how that started was I was invited to a conference in Austin, Texas, to where I met a gentleman by the name of Dr. John Hall. Now, Dr. John Hall really is an American hero. He is the author of 2 books. He's a board-certified physician, and his first book was called A New Breed: Satellite Terrorism in America. And the inspiration behind him writing that book was because the phenomenon I'm going to discuss with your audience today happened to someone who was very close and dear to him. It was his fiance. And he wrote a second book called Guinea Pigs: Technologies of Control. And in that book, he writes about some of my efforts through ISAC that we have done over the last almost 2 decades. So when I met Dr. Hall, we had a discussion regarding a phenomenon that was happening. He had individuals coming to him that were complaining about hearing some strange signal, almost a frequency being transmitted to them. And it was followed by short-term, long-term memory loss, or what could be described as brain fog, a vertigo, nausea, vomiting, electrical shocks to the extremities. And he felt that because they were complaining about hearing some type of frequency, that if it were true, that we should be able to detect that frequency. And so what he did, he used what is called a frequency detector, which was called the JM20 Pro at the time. And its accuracy, according to the manufacturer, is about 1 part per million as far as its sensitivity and accuracy. So he was testing people, and they were coming up positive around their person for some type of frequency near them. And so I asked him, I said, well, if we're able to do that, why isn't anything being done about it? And what he said is, if you went to your doctor and expressed the complaints that these people were complaining about, they would be labeled automatically with a mental disorder and be put on medications and then be further victimized. Now, this year, the Department of Homeland Security on May 8th held a hearing about a phenomenon called Havana syndrome, or anomalous health incidences. And that, according to them, that came about in 2016. because our diplomats in Havana, Cuba, at the U.S. Embassy were complaining about hearing the strange signal being transmitted to them, followed by short-term, long-term memory loss, brain fog, vertigo, nausea, and strange ailments to their extremities, almost like a electrical vibration going through them. And Colonel Greg Egren testified at that hearing that indeed this phenomenon is real. It is happening here in the United States on our homeland and abroad. And he said it is happening to the very best of our best in the federal government. Not only the best of our U.S. diplomats, but the best of our CIA agents, the best of our FBI agents, and it is now happening to congressional members here in the United States. Now, they claim that this was a directed energy weapon that was being pointed at them. I have been following this topic, thanks to Dr. John Hall's inspiration, since late 2009. And what we created was the International Center Against the Abuse of Covert Technologies, along with two other gentlemen. And the emphasis of that was to take these subjective complaints that people were complaining about and turn it into objective data. And so I sent out dissemination and information. They were looking for people. If you're having these symptoms, please come talk to us. And on our first meeting was held in Sacramento, California, and 100 people showed up. And they all had the exact same complaints with very, very little deviation. And so I felt strongly, I said, I was surprised because I only expected about a dozen people to show up, but having 100 there was pretty significant. So I decided to do the radio frequency scanning on a large scale. And so we had our first conference in Davis, California, and 300 people showed up. And it was rather daunting, overwhelming, but that's when we started doing the scanning. And what the data started to paint, as far as a picture goes, there were ethnical criteria, at least it appeared initially, as to who was being affected the most. And at first it was Caucasian females in their 40s, highly educated, recently single, widowed, or divorced. Then it was Caucasian males, then African American females, African American males, Asians in the same categories. Then it dwindled down in ethnicity from there. Now, we did this in the Midwest, same results, and then until we got to Chicago where it flipped. Then number one that was most affected was African American females, African American males, Caucasian females, Caucasian males, Asians, and it dwindled down from there. And that remained consistent all the way to the East Coast, with one anomaly, which was in Virginia. And in Virginia, a group of folks had heard what I had been doing, and it was all military subcontractors, and they asked me to come and do RF scanning there. Now, I wanted to do the RF scanning, and I did something a little bit different. I started testing for high suggestibility. Now, I've been practicing hypnosis since early 2000, became a certified master hypnotist in 2014 with my diploma in hypnotherapy. The reason I did that is because I started to notice a phenomenon. The people who were most affected in a very negative way tended to be highly suggestible in nature. Now, the reason that's important and significant is when we get into what we were finding, you'll understand why having this susceptibility can potentially be dangerous. So what were we finding? So we can superimpose three groups. The groups that were complaining about this phenomenon, which we will say AHIs or Havana syndrome, you can superimpose their frequency scans over each other, and they all light up at very focal motor points in an exact same way. Then you had a second group, which was the military, those who had been in the military. You can superimpose their scans over each other. They were slightly different, but they lit up in the same way. And then you had the group of those who had been incarcerated. And those who were incarcerated were different than the other two groups, but matched up in the exact identical way. And so always found that to be interesting initially when we had the data. Now, Colonel Egren testified to the Department of Homeland Security that this is a directed energy weapon. this is how those diplomats, the agents and stuff were being affected. But the problem with that theory is that some of the diplomats claimed that while they were in their car, their home, a restaurant, didn't matter. The signal still followed them. So we were always of the belief that for whatever reason, the people who were hearing this unusual signal had to have something internally within them that allowed them to receive the signal. So there was something, unfortunately, special about them that allowed them to do this. And why? We know that when we were in the United States doing the testing, that the biggest complaint was they couldn't get away from it. And so we wanted to test that there, and we would take people down into granite caverns, miles down underneath the earth, where there's no radio signals, no cell signals, nothing like that can be out in those regions. And when we took them down there and we did RF testing on them, we were still detecting signals. So what that told us that this signal has to be satellite based. So in my journeys, I was invited by a foreign government to come overseas in Europe and test members from the embassy there, including family members. And they wanted me to bring people who I felt were victims of this. And they took me to a research facility that I had to sign an NDA to. And they allowed me to use what is called an anechoic chamber. Now, an anechoic chamber is a very robust environment that blocks out frequency spectrums. In this case, this facility blocked out frequency spectrums from 9 kilohertz to 18 gigahertz, which is huge. And we knew that those frequencies, spectrum bands, were large enough span that it would encompass the frequencies that we were detecting out in the field. So we took control groups, so people not complaining of anything, put them in the anechoic chamber, tested them for frequency emissions, and what we were getting was 0. And it put a smile on our face because we now knew that we were in the perfect environment to test people if indeed there was a frequency emission from their person. So as we used the controls, we knew we were in the right environment. Then we started bringing in the people to be tested in that environment. And we'll show some video and pictures for you. And when we tested them, we were detecting frequencies. It was at this point that we understood, for whatever reason, that frequency emissions were coming from the human body in these specific individuals. Now, what we are finding is, I'm going to share my screen here. And so what we were finding is that we were pulling out implants and biosensors, to be more specific. Now, this is one of my earliest clients, a very sweet lady that this was done to. And you'll see here, this is a photomicrographic report. And they pulled out 3 specimens here. And the redaction is to protect the physician and in this case, it's a patient, so that we can protect their names and so they're not being bombarded by media and so forth. But anyway, to go further along, a chain of custody was utilized so that we could retain the evidence, so we cannot be accused of altering it or manipulating it in any way. And what they ended up finding is that this was actually not biological material, but technological biosensors. And I will leave a link for you and your guests to access all of this information. We're very transparent, and it's important that the more educated you are in this, the better off you're going to be, particularly if this is a phenomenon that happens to you. So this is actually a biosensor. This is actually a nano antenna. Our bodies do not reject these things. They'll actually engulf it with our tissue, which is interesting. They come in various shapes and sizes. In this case, there were 3 pulled out of this young lady. And these are the images of them. Okay. So they're very small. They're approaching nano size, which means you can put literally easily fit these in the tip of a needle. Okay. And I'm going to show you the progression over the years of what has happened as far as size and how small they are becoming. So in the 40s and 50s, through a Freedom of Information Act release, we know that the U.S. military had been experimenting with microchips, putting them in soldiers, and they were the size of a large grain of rice. And over the years, they became the size of a small grain of rice. Now, this case here are biosensors that were removed from a politician down in Southern California. This is the Larson case. Now, this was in late 2009. He had multiple biosensors removed from his person. I believe over 10 if you looked at the full report. I want your audience to pay attention. Now, this was in late 2009. Look at the size of these biosensors, 2 letters on a penny. Some were 4 or 5 letters. They come in various shapes and sizes. And what do? They transmit data in real time. And Mr. Larson sued the medical corporation that did this to him, and he lost. It was thrown out of court because he inadvertently participated and signed paperwork to participate in an experiment. The issue, though, is he was not given full disclosure. If he had been, he would never have allowed them to do this because whether they knew it or not at the time, this is torture. 24/7, 365 days a year. The ailments that people go through with this. I'm going to show you a case that is a traditional grain of rice size implant. Now, this case here is the Bob Boyce case. Bob Boyce, and I've spoke to him on the phone regarding all of this. He developed terminal cancer, and what you're looking at is a cancerous tumor. And at the end of these tweezers is an RFID chip. Now, Bob Boyce was the inventor of a high-efficiency engine, and he had inventions that he would test for RF leakage. And he was in a Faraday cage, which is a smaller version of the anechoic chamber that we used. And he had the same type of equipment that we had. And the wand accidentally went by his person and it pinged. So he thought that was odd because it's coming from him. And so he went and got an x-ray, and what they saw in the x-ray was this tumor, and inside the tumor was this microchip. So he had it surgically removed, and I asked Bob, and I go, Bob, what happened to the microchip after it went to pathology? And he goes, mysteriously enough, it disappeared. And I said, well, I'm not surprised. But Bob, nonetheless, was happy because his cancer went into remission. But very shortly thereafter, it came back very aggressively. And when it came back aggressively, he went back into the Faraday cage, did another RF scan. They found a second microchip in him. Now, this time they were smart and they used a chain of custody. And they were able to obtain a digital serial number off this microchip. And when they traced it back, it went back to an NSA database. And his case was stalled under the auspices of national security. People always ask, well, how did this happen to him? You know, in this case, when you're talking about these RFID chips, the larger ones, you really need a big needle, like a horse needle. And Bob loved Mountain Dew, and he was in his office one day, and his business partner brought him a Mountain Dew. And then mysteriously enough, Bob woke up 3 days later. So he lost track of time for 3 days. Turns out his business partner worked for the NSA. So this is how this was done in Bob's case. And this all sounds very sci-fi, science fiction, but I'm about to go over a couple of declassified reports. And then we found the smoking gun that I'll share with everyone. And this is why I've made this our mission. So this is a declassified report done by our United States Air Force, released in November of 1994. Through a FOIA request, it was obtained in 1995. And this report was done by our United States Air Force in order to keep us a superpower 50 years into the future. And this is the Defense Technical Information Center. And New World Vistas, and then again, your audience has full access to this. I made a short out of this because it's 222 pages long, and I didn't want to have to fumble through when I'm doing these interviews. So on page 89 of that report, there's a section called Biological Processes. And I'm going to go ahead and read some highlighted areas. And it says, it appears likely that there are a number of physical agents that might actively but largely benignly interact or interfere with biological processes in an adversary in a manner that will provide our armed forces the tools to control these adversaries without extensive loss of life or property. These physical agents could include acoustic fields, optical fields, electromagnetic fields, and combinations thereof. This paper will address only the prospect of physical regulation of biological processes using electromagnetic fields. Prior to the mid-21st century, there will be a virtual explosion of knowledge in the field of neuroscience. We will have achieved a clear understanding of how human brains work, how it really controls the various functions of the body, and how it can be manipulated, both positively and negatively. One can envision the development of electromagnetic energy sources, the output of which can be pulsed, shaped, and focused, that can couple with the human body in a fashion that will allow one to prevent voluntary muscular movements, control emotions, and thus your actions, produce sleep, transmit suggestions, interfere with both short-term, long-term memory. Remember what the diplomats are complaining about. Produce an experience set and delete an experience set. This will open the door for the development of some novel capabilities that can be used in armed conflict and terrorist hostage situations and in training. New weapons that offer the opportunity of control of an adversary without resorting to lethal solution or collateral casualties can be developed around this concept. This would offer significant improvements in the capabilities of our special operation forces. Initial experimentation should be focused on the interaction of electromagnetic energy and the neuromuscular junctions involved in voluntary muscular control. Now, if that's not crazy enough, here's where it gets pretty ridiculous. It would also appear possible to create high-fidelity speech in the human body. A lot of these victims complain about hearing voices, including the diplomats. Raising the possibility of covert suggestion and psychological direction. When a high-power microwave pulse in the gigahertz range strikes the human body, a very small temperature perturbation occurs. This is associated with the sudden expansion of the slightly heated tissue. This expansion is fast enough to produce an acoustic wave. If a pulse stream is used, it should be possible to create an internal acoustic field in the 5 to 15 kilohertz range, which is audible. Thus, it may be possible to talk to selected adversaries in a fashion that would be most disturbing to them. This was used in the Middle East. They were transmitting Allah's voice to who they were calling the terrorists, and they were giving up in hundreds, in droves, because they thought Allah was talking to them. In comparison to the discussion in the paragraphs above, the concept of imprinting experience set is highly speculative, but nonetheless highly exciting. Modern electromagnetic scattering theory raises the prospect that ultra-short pulse scattering through the human brain can result in reflective signals that can be used to construct a reliable estimate of degree of central nervous system arousal. The concept behind this remote EEG is to scatter off action potentials or ensembles of action potentials in major central nervous system tracts. Assuming we will understand how our skills are imprinted and recalled, it might be possible to take this concept one step further and duplicate the experience set in another individual. So that is the New World Vistas report. Now remember, this was written over 30 years ago. And imagine how many years they've had it before they came up with this report. So we know it's a minimum of 30 years ago. My speculation, it's probably about 40 years in the making. Okay, now here's the smoking gun that I'll share with everyone. And the smoking gun is this document here. This is a court case It's called the DeVore case. It was filed in California, in Southern California. And this is Dawn DeVore. She was a nurse for the Department of Corrections. She became a whistleblower, and this phenomenon was done to her. The very exact type of implants that were removed from my client were removed from Dawn DeVore. And unfortunately, but fortunately for us, unfortunately that this happened to Dawn, but fortunately, she was able to obtain a document that was submitted as evidence in this court case, and it's known as Exhibit 2. And this is important for everyone to pay close attention to, because this particular company, back when the Jews were in concentration camps, came up with the punch card system. People don't know that it was IBM who created that system. Now look who is on the top of this document here. It says IntelliConnection, a security division of IBM. Confidential, limited distribution only, level 9 communication. So this was only supposed to be amongst the head management of the Department of Corrections. And in this case, it was Pelican Bay. And it's titled 2020 Neurochip Implant. The control of crime will be a paramount concern in the 21st century. We must be ready with our security products when the demand for them becomes popular. Our Research and Development Division has been in contact with the Federal Bureau of Prisons, the California Department of Corrections, the Texas Department of Public Safety, and the Massachusetts Department of Corrections to run limited trials of the 2020 neurochip implant. We have established representatives of our interest in both management and institutional levels within these departments. That should be a crime of itself. Federal regulations do not yet permit testing of implants on prisoners, yet they're doing it. But we have entered into contractual agreements with privatized healthcare professionals and specified correctional personnel to do limited testing of our products. We have also had major success in privately owned sanitariums with implant technology. We need, however, to expand our testing to research how effective the 2020 neurochip implant performs in those identified as the most aggressive in our society. Limited testing has produced a number of results. In California, several prisoners were identified as members of a security threat group. They were brought to the health services unit at Pelican Bay and tranquilized with advanced sedatives developed by our Cambridge, Massachusetts laboratories. The implant procedures take 60 to 90 minutes depending upon the experience of the technician. We are working on a device that will reduce that time by as much as 60%. The results of the implants on 8 prisoners yielded the following results. Implants served as surveillance monitoring device for the threat group. Remember when I talked about that in that previous document, there is no such thing as privacy when this is done to you, and you'll understand why here in a second. Implants disabled 2 subjects during an assault on correctional staff. All they had to do was send a frequency to the implants. It incapacitated them. Universal side effects in all 8 test subjects revealed that when the implant was transmitted 116 megahertz, subjects became lethargic and slept on an average of 18 to 22 hours. So they induced long-term lethargy. All subjects refused recreation periods for 14 days. If you're lethargic, why are you going to want to do anything, right? 7 of the 8 subjects did not exercise at all. Again, that retains to that. Each subject was monitored for aggressive activity during the test period, and the findings are conclusive that out of the 8 test subjects exhibited no aggression even when they were provoked. Each subject experienced only minor bleeding from the nose and ears 48 hours after the implant due to the initial adjustment. What they're referring to is the body rejecting these implants. Each subject experienced only minor bleeding from the nose and ears 48 hours after the implant due to initial adjustment. Each subject had no knowledge of the implant for the test period, and each implant was retrieved under the guise of medical treatment. It should be noted that the test period was for less than 2 months. However, during that period, substantial data was gathered by our research and development team. which suggests that the implants exceeded expected results. One of the major concerns of the security and the R&D team was that the test subject would discover the chemical imbalance during the initial adjustment period, and the test would have to be scrubbed. However, due to the advanced technological developments in the sedatives administered, the 48-hour adjustment period can be attributed to the prescription medication given to the test subjects after the implant procedure. So they want to blame it on the drugs, not what the reality was, that it was their bodies rejecting these implants. And that's what they were feeling. One of the concerns raised by the R&D was the cause of the bleeding and how to eliminate that problem. Unexplained bleeding might cause the subject to inquire further about the routine visit to the infirmary or other healthcare facility. The security windfall from the brief test period was enormous. Security officials now know several strategies employed by this threat group that facilitate the transmission of illegal drugs and weapons into the correctional facilities. One intelligence officer remarked that while we cannot use this information in a court of law, now they know who to watch outside as far as connections go. They have the prison at Soledad is now considering transferring 3 subjects to Vacaville prison, where we have ongoing implant research. Now I have a declassified document that shows that they've been doing this since the 70s, particularly at Vacaville with this implant technology. Our technicians have promised that they can do 3 2020 neurochip implants in less than an hour. Soledad officials hope to collect information from the trio to bring a 14-month investigation into drug trafficking by correctional officers to a close. Essentially, the implants make the unsuspecting prisoner a walking, talking recorder of every event he comes in contact with. There are only 5 intelligence officers and the Commissioner of Corrections who actually know the full scope of this testing. And I'm going to go and stop it there because I think that's enough information where everyone can see this is very jaw-dropping, smoking gun information. But this is why we're here. We're here to educate everyone. We're now not only detecting frequencies emitting from the human body in these individuals who are complaining of this phenomena, we are now pulling out implants, biosensors. And this is the reason we strongly believe that these individuals have been receiving this strange signal that they've been hearing. And what I'll do next is I will share a video. What I'm going to share is how we concluded this. So I'm just going to walk through this and explain what we're seeing here. Okay, this is Colonel Egrin at the Department of Homeland Security testifying that this phenomenon is happening here in the homeland. He testifies that this is happening on every continent on the planet with the exception of Antarctica. And what I'm going to show here, this is the preliminary scan, what we do out in the field, what you have, and this is sped up just until we get to the first positive location. Now, this is called a JM20 Pro. The wand is extended because depending on the length, you're testing for specific frequencies bands. So we'll do a fully retracted, then we'll do midway out, and then we'll do a full extension. And what you're going to see here in a moment is that you see a blinking red light. And now this is how Bob Boyce found his RFID chip in him. This is an JM20 Pro RF detector. And this particular individual is a licensed medical professional, very well respected in the community, and she was having these exact symptoms. And so we can calibrate this to where we have to be within 2 inches of an emission. We live in a wireless society, so that's important that we had equipment that could do that. And notice how I have her lean away, turns off, come towards it, it detects it. And now I'm having her step away. Now we're at step towards the wand, comes on. So it's very, very specific. And this was in the TMJ area. And what we'll do is we'll tag it so that we can come back with a frequency counter to see if we can detect a numerical frequency. I'm going to go ahead and advance this till we get to that portion. And again, you'll have links, all your listeners will have links to this. Now, many of the victims suffer emotional trauma from this. She had a breakdown here because not only did she realize she wasn't crazy, but the fact that someone did this to her. And this is no different than a rape, is how I explain to people. When someone invades your body without your permission and does this to you, it's the ultimate, I can't even come up with the word. It's just devastation that one would go through. And she came up positive in about 4 locations. And now this is the part that I want to show you. This is the frequency reader. And again, this is probably one of the strongest emissions in the field that we've ever detected. You're going to see here in just a second when I talk about when we're testing for numerical frequency. See the bar graph, it is just pinging. That's how strong that emission was in the region that she came up positive at. And so this is the frequency counter that we use after we detect it with the frequency detector. So that's how that works. Now, as we go through the process, we look for radiographic imagery. As you'll see here, this is an MRI scan. You can actually see one of the Verichip style implants in the TMJ on this individual. You also have a panoramic X-ray that shows a foreign body in there. And then ultimately, this is a nonlinear junction scan. We do a secondary type scan that will not only test for active implants, but it also tests for passive implants. So active, it's on 24/7, 365 days a year. Passive has to be activated with a frequency. So what a nonlinear junction scan will do is it will send an echo testing for ferrous material. If it detects it, it'll get a reflection back and send a secondary transmission that will turn the implant on. And then it'll throw a third echo to see if we can get the frequency. And so this is the type of scan that we do after they test positive in a preliminary junction scan. I mean, a preliminary RF scan. And this is when the person is in the environment, this frequency is only there when that person is in that environment when we're testing. And this is the anechoic chamber. This is when I was invited over to that facility over in Europe. And what you're about to see is the anechoic chamber that I described. This is that environment that blocks out frequencies between 9 kilohertz and 18 gigahertz. We're going to use a control. This is a person from the embassy there. And we go do the same process. We'll use the frequency detector, see if we detect anything. And as we expected, we didn't find anything on this person. And then we'll come back. And this is when we knew we were in the correct environment here in a second. We tested her with, whoops, I went past it. Okay. This is, we're testing to see if we get any frequency emissions. Notice how it reads 0. As long as that light is flashing, it's scanning for frequencies. So this is when we knew we're in the perfect environment. If we were going to prove that these emissions were coming from the human body, then this was the time. This was the day. This is another person. This is actually someone, an elected official in the government there. And we tested him also. He was not complaining of any symptoms. And he also tested 0. Now we're going to bring in that first control, which was the young lady. And we're bringing someone who had an RF scan, came up positive in the preliminary RF scan, who was having symptoms. And this is a frequency reader. Notice how it's flashing red. It's scanning for frequencies, and lo and behold, we're detecting them. And so we'll gate it down till we get the strongest frequency. And there we go. So we get the control. We have them switch places in the anechoic chamber so that we can do the same procedure with her. And here's where we had conclusive evidence. Again, a non-symptomatic person testing zero, the symptomatic person coming up positive for frequency emissions. So it was at this step that we can move further on into the implant removal. And this was the document that I shared with your audience earlier. And so that is everything from A to Z. How we've come to this conclusion today, this is happening in our homeland, and it's happening all over the world. I get complaints, literally just thousands of inquiries a week. And this is where we're at. And it's important that we educate everyone, because when I was talking about suggestibility, there are two cases in the United States that stand out. One was by a gentleman of Aaron Alexis, and the other one was Myron May. Aaron Alexis was a U.S. soldier who contacted me complaining of these symptoms. When this happens to someone, you're either in fight or flight. Most people are in flight, but his personality type was that he was a fighter. I did not know that he was going to do what he was planning on. And the same thing for Myron May, who was an attorney out of Florida, who called me and had these exact same symptoms. Now, Myron May ended up, he didn't have the patience. He didn't want to be patient, because I told him this is not a quick fix. This is a long journey, because we have to do the other evidence gathering process. And he didn't wait, and he went and killed 16 people at the Navy Yard, where he felt that this signal was being emitted from. And he inscribed on the butt of his rifle, "This is my ELF weapon." Extremely low frequency is what that stood for. And then Myron May went and killed 2 people at the university there in the research department, where he thought it was coming from. And the reason I bring this up as far as suggestibility goes, in our history, it's not unknown that the United States has been involved in experimenting on our own people. They funded a Canadian psychiatrist by the name of Ewan Cameron in the infancy stages, where they were trying to see if they can erase an adult human brain and re-imprint it with new memories. And Ewan Cameron would use techniques like electric shock therapy, induce long-term sleep with drugs, and then he would put a helmet over their heads, and he'd have a tape recorder in it, repeating looped themes over and over again, and he messed up a lot of people. Well, that was called psychic driving in its infancy. Now think about everything that I've shared with your audience today. This is now psychic driving on steroids. And if you're so unlucky, now 30% of the population is naturally highly suggestible. But if you're unlucky enough to have that suggestibility attribute, and you're unlucky enough to fall under this phenomenon, this is psychic driving on steroids. And this is why, if you are highly suggestible and you are afflicted by this phenomenon, or believe you might be, we really want to reach out to you and talk to you first to see if we can help you and coach you through the process. And I know that's a lot to intake, but that's where we're at.